Chapter 20. Gray Hair, Gray Eyes. When Savitz was out of the room, Everett went back to the table and examined Hilda's note. A feeling of having reached the end of a long journey came over him. He had for years given up the idea that Hilda was dead. The dead are forgotten sooner or later, and he never forgot her. What he had feared during these years was that time had brought her low. Girls in her condition, the condition he had left her in, invariably sank. His social work had impressed this upon him. There were streets in Chicago he avoided passing in the late afternoon or at night for fear that he might on one of them meet Hilda. Hilda painted, Hilda vulgar, Hilda in the gutter, soiled beyond recognition, degraded beyond help. He studied her handwriting. It was no longer the girlish hand he had once known. It was firm, businesslike. There was precision in the writing and character, the handwriting of a person with responsibilities. A sudden pride welled up within him, pride for Hilda, for the plucky fight she had made against odds, such odds. The pride turned to pain. A pang ran through him. He had been thinking of Hilda as if she had been his, or at any rate one very near to him. He had been admiring her pluck in having swerved from the road to the abyss. Had he forgotten that it was he who had started her on that road? He had not forgotten. He was not forgetting. He realized the full import of the situation. The finding of Hilda signified the closing of one chapter in his life. It also meant the opening of another. Yes, now that he had found her, he would. He was gasping for breath. The window was at the other end of the room. He stepped up to it, raised it, pulled the curtains wide apart, and a flood of moonlight poured in. The night was perfectly still. It was a stillness Raymond Everett had not yet known, the stillness of night in the far west, the stillness of the desert. It was not of death the quiet spoke, but of life, of living. Nature was going about its business in her own serene, dignified way. He was gazing at the mountains cloaked in gray mist, and the shadowy giants seemed to him engrossed in deep meditation and a bit frowning. Was it the town which had sprung up at their feet that annoyed them? Were they frowning at the people intruding upon them, disturbing their calm? The people who were digging into their vitals, hammering off metal crumbs and squabbling over them? He took in the city with his gaze, the larger buildings in the center, the smaller houses rising out of the ground like mushrooms, the mills further away. A strange newness lay over it and was giving it a fantastic, almost unreal appearance. It was as if the city was but a toy set down among these mountains for giant children to play with. A sense of smallness came over Everett, smallness and helplessness. He was thinking of the trouble between the miners and the mine owners, the strike, which he and the other commissioners were to try and settle. How absurdly pitiful these quarrels between man and man were. The strike. Hilda was concerned in it. Hilda. His thoughts reverted to himself, to the unexpected situation. It was scarcely an hour since he had learned of Hilda and the child, and already his past had released its grip over him. He was free. Since Hilda had disappeared from his horizon, he had not shown the world his true face. He had not been himself. He had done what others wanted him to do. At first it was his father, then his wife. He had worn a mask all these years. The mask was off now. He was wondering what the years had done to Hilda. Had she aged much? She must have. And her mind, her character, no doubt they were as beautiful as ever. She showed such restraint, such dignity in her note to him. She is pretty nearly everything. They are consulting her about everything. With what admiration the miner Savitz had spoken these words. How much she must have suffered in those 10 years before she compelled people to have such trust in her, to have such admiration for her. The last lights had gone out. Vulcan City was asleep. Raymond was now gazing in the direction in which Savitz had said his home lay, where Hilda was living. There was but 10 minutes' walk between himself and Hilda and the child. Within 10 minutes' walk from his hotel, his son was asleep now, his son whom he had never seen. The child probably never suspected that he had a father living, let alone that his father was so near. Questions began to flash through his brain. What if Hilda should refuse to have anything to do with him? She might. What if she should refuse to let him see the child? She had every right to do so. It was she who had been wronged. It was he who had wronged her. Yes, what then? A sudden resolution came upon him. He would put an end to that 10 minutes distance between them. He would go at once and find the place where she and the child were living. He must see it, even if only from a distance. He must have a look at the house where the child lived, played, dreamed, at once. He got into his long black raincoat and went down into the street. The directions which John Savitz had given him were explicit, and he walked in accordance with them. He walked along the main street almost to its very end. Houses were fewer here. The newness of the city extended to the street signs. They were clear and sharp. He read them easily. At Needles Avenue, he stopped. He was to go to the left. The fifth house on the right-hand side of the street was the house Hilda lived in. For a moment, he stood still. Was it all a dream? Had he been dreaming? He felt Hilda's letter in his pocket. It was real. The fifth house from the corner. He started forward with beating heart. He was going on the left side of the street. He could see better at a distance from the opposite side. The house stood a little apart from the others. It was bigger and in somewhat better style. It had apparently been built as a home by someone and was now rented to the miner, to Savitz. There was a tree in front of it. It was casting a shadow. He stopped and was looking straight at the simple frame structure. On the porch, someone was sitting, a woman. A white dress and something dark over the shoulders and chest. The figure was peering at him, too. Another instant, and his blood stood still. It was Hilda. He had recognized her. The woman must have recognized him, too, for she rose as if lifted out of her chair and stepped into the house. The lock creaked loudly as she turned it in the door. Everett's feet refused to carry him. A dog, evidently attracted by the creak of the lock, came around from the rear of the house. On perceiving a man standing across the street, it yelped 2 or 3 times. Then, apparently concluding that the stranger was not dangerous and was not worth wasting his energy on, The dog lay down in the middle of the path leading to the house. He started back for the hotel. In his room, Everett paced the floor for some time. Suddenly, things began to swim before his eyes. His head was swimming. The ground seemed to be swimming out from under his feet. He caught hold of the bedpost, leaned against it, and wept as he had not wept since he was a child. Morning was breaking when Everett finally fell asleep. He woke 2 hours later and sat up with a start. There was something he was to do, something vital, urgent, that would brook no delay. Something. He was straining his thoughts to recall what it was. It had been so clear to him just before he opened his eyes, but was snuffed out like a candle on waking. He could not recall and looked about in a daze. Suddenly, his eyes fell upon his hand, the wedding ring on it. It had been there 5 years. He took it off. At 10 o'clock, the members of the commission went to work arranging for the hearings. People were already waiting for them from the mine managers, from the union. Raymond Everett studied the latter. He had a feeling of personal obligation to them. They were Hilda's friends. It was among them that she and the child had found their livelihood. They had sheltered and protected her. Good people. All through the forenoon it seemed to him that Hilda must come in any minute. He was continually gazing at the door, and spots of red suffused themselves over his face and neck every time it opened. She did not come. After lunch, he took a stroll through Vulcan City's main street. Perhaps he would meet her on the street. Such accidents happened in the bigger cities, why not here? But it did not happen. Hilda was nowhere to be seen. She appeared nowhere the rest of the day. At nightfall, he slipped out of the hotel and started for her house. Savitz met him at the door and led him into the living room. Neither Savitz nor Hilda had said anything about the probability of Everett coming to the house, but both expected him. Hilda was awaiting his coming in her room, Savitz at the window. It was the miner's effusiveness as host, an effusiveness that was not without design, that lightened Hilda's entry into the living room and made it easier for Everett to start forward and extend his hand to her as to an old acquaintance. Savitz, too, was taking the lead in the conversation in these first few minutes by speaking commonplaces about the long journey from the east, about Vulcan City hotels as compared with those in Chicago. He had been to Chicago, and about the coming investigation into the miners' troubles. As soon as the first embarrassing moments were over, Savitz excused himself. He had to run downtown on an important errand. He shook hands with Raymond Everett cordially and left the room. Everett was wondering how much the miner might know of his relations with Hilda. Hilda, on the other hand, felt that Savitz knew all, had guessed everything. She was grateful to him for the way he had managed things. A mother would not have done things more delicately for her daughter. With the exit of the miner, the thread of conversation was broken between them. Neither of them knew how to begin to talk the things they wished to say to one another. Each had expected to find the other different. Raymond's picture in the newspaper, in spite of the stern look it had, gave no clear conception of his age. Hilda had expected to find him younger looking. His hair was nearly all gray. His face was lined as she had never seen it lined in a man so young. There was not a trace of cheerfulness in his features. It was Hilda's eyes that struck Everett above everything else. He had found her looking much better than he had dared dream. She showed not a gray hair, and there were no glaring wrinkles in her face. But her eyes told the story of the 10 years they had been apart. All the grayness, despair, and helplessness of those years were settled in her eyes. They were sitting across the table from each other. Both felt awkward over their silence. But the silence was sweet. It was rest, the rest from the knife which had just cut a wound open. "Mama!" a child's voice rang out, the door flew open, and little Raymond landed in the middle of the room. He stood still where he was and gazed at the man who was sitting across the table from his mother. He had recognized Everett from the picture he had seen in the paper. He was not surprised, as if he had been expecting to see the man. Everett rose, took a step forward, cleared his throat as if to speak, but could not, and extended his hand silently to the boy. Little Raymond took it. Everett held his hand somewhat longer than the child seemed to expect, and little Raymond fixed his eyes upon him shyly. As soon as his hand was free, he quickly sidled up to his mother. She put her arm about him while he rested his head against her shoulder. Hilda broke the silence. She felt that she had to speak, or she would cry out. She asked about Stillwell. Had Mr. Everett been to Stillwell lately? He had. Everett had been visiting the town quite frequently in the past 8 or 9 years. He was fond of going over the old places. He was telling her about them. Everett was speaking feverishly and was speaking with his eyes as well as with his lips. He was trying to convey things to Hilda, the things that were not easy to speak of. He was trying to convey to her that he had been going to Stillwell frequently, had been hunting out the old scenes and places in the vain hope of finding a trace of her. His sentences were broken and incoherent. Little Raymond listened and looked perplexed. In recent years, Everett added, he had been going to Stillwell for another reason. His father was buried there. Before his death, Henry Everett had asked to be buried in Stillwell. The mention of death gave Hilda an opportunity to heave a sigh which had been choking her. He went on talking about Stillwell. In his last years, his father had lost his fondness for Chicago. His mother had never liked it, and looked back longingly upon the early, happier period of his life in the Wisconsin town. Altogether, his father had changed before his death. One could reason with him then as one could not when he was younger. He had suffered much in his last years. He had been sick nearly all the time and died hard. The conversation turned about this family pivot longer than either of them intended. As Hilda listened, she was thinking that Raymond's voice had not altered as much as his appearance. It was the same voice that she had known, soft and honest, only deeper and more vibrant. The evidence of suffering stood out here, too. They were still talking of Stillwell and the past when Savitz returned. Everett could not protract his visit any longer and rose to go. With Savitz leading, Hilda and the boy followed Everett into the yard and to the gate. It was Savitz who asked him to call again, Hilda seconding his invitation somewhat uncertainly. Everett shook hands with them. Little Raymond's hand he took last, and again held it long. His voice seemed somewhat throttled as he said good night to the boy. Hilda went into her room and was making the child's bed. Little Raymond was plying her with questions. She and Everett had talked about things which he had never heard her speak of before. He wanted to know about these and about Mr. Everett, who he was, how she came to know him. Since little Raymond was an infant, Hilda had been preparing for questions, these and many others, and she now answered them. She told the child of her early life, her parents, her childhood in Stillwell, and how she and Everett were playmates. She told him as much as she thought best for a child of his age to know. "Is he coming again?" Raymond wanted to know as he was slipping into bed. "Why?" Hilda questioned him in turn. "Because I would like to see him again." "Would you?" "Yes, wouldn't you?" he rejoined quickly. Hilda walked off without answering him. She took a book and pretended to be reading. In reality, she was thinking about the child, wondering whether the presence of Everett, of his father, had in any way communicated itself to him, whether he had sensed it. Little Raymond lay in bed quiet, but she knew he was not sleeping. Suddenly she caught his eyes. They had a nervous sparkle and were fixed on her. "Aren't you sleeping yet?" she asked. "I'm not sleepy," he answered. To Hilda, there suddenly seemed something grown up in the tone of his voice. It sounded like that of a man. She walked over to his bed and tucked the quilt closer about him. The youngster caught hold of her hand and began caressing it. He pleaded with her to sit down on the bed beside him, and she did. "Mama," he asked with a quaver, "why did my father have to die so young?" "Come, child," she said, her own voice growing husky. "You are asking silly questions. Why does anybody die? Death comes, and one dies." "Then death may come and take me or you too any time?" "Go to sleep, child." Hilda rose. "You must not think such things. It is late. Go to sleep." She moved away and began to undress. The boy was still gazing at her with his flashing eyes. He was not satisfied with her answers. She quickly turned the light out and went to bed. More than an hour later, when Hilda thought him asleep for a long time, he called again. "What is it?" she asked. "Mother, what makes people's faces sad?" "Go to sleep, child. You will never be in time for school tomorrow." She tried to make her voice ring severe. In her heart, she was pleased with the child's questioning. She noticed that their thoughts seemed to be running parallel on all important matters. She, too, had just been wondering why Everett's face was so sad. It was not a passing sadness. It was a sadness left there by years of lonely, cheerless living. Yes, she mused, Raymond was unhappy. How strangely life worked. How different she had expected their meeting to be. Their roles were changed. It was not she, but Raymond that was drifting rudderless through life. She lay awake for hours, thinking of the past, the future. Raymond would come again. There was no doubt in her mind that he would. He would not let her go now that he knew where to find her. He would come. He would want. She knew what he would want. She had seen him gaze at the child all evening, hold his little hand. The child was sleeping. She could hear his even breathing. A warmth was surging through her and a happiness. She rose, left her bed, and walked over to the boy. She felt his head and face. His warm breath touched her flesh. She passed her hand gently over the entire length of his tall, thin frame. The tears fell from her eyes. At the hotel, Raymond Everett was in the midst of a long letter to Hilda. What he could not speak, he wrote. On paper, he went down on his knees to her. He had been wrong, wrong, wrong. He had had no character. He was not now trying to mitigate this wrong. He was making no defense, but he had paid for his weakness. And all these years, she, Hilda, had not been out of his consciousness for an instant. He could not forget her. He did not try to forget her. And Hilda was not the only one he had sinned against. He had sinned also against the other woman, the one he called his wife. For though he lived with her in wedlock, his soul had remained unwedded. He had sinned heinously by not marrying Hilda, whom he loved, and by marrying this woman whom he did not love. The past was not to be revoked, but the future was here and to be molded. He would mold this future on a foundation of truth and love. Now that he had found her, Hilda, and their child, he would institute proceedings for separation from his wife. In the future, his life, should belong to her and to their child, whether she chose to accept it or not. When he finished his letter to Hilda, Raymond Everett walked over to the window and gazed for some time in the direction of the Savetts' home. Then he undressed, went to bed, and was asleep in a few moments.